to the Midrash. First part is 1 Corinthians 12 in the previous reading. Thought that the whole thing will take a while. We have to do it, but and chapters and oh yeah, for sure. So starting with those things that charged Paul with is being okay eating meat sacrificed to idols. I really don't think that's the case, and we can kind of go through that, but what we talked about once before is this appears to be like Paul is 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. They instruct previous correspondence, so really this is probably a don't have 1 Corinthians.
Considering how much else he wrote, is it could be 6.
Yes, that could be true. In fact, chapter 7, also we see it in chapter 8. Here's some of the passages that talk about that. This is the True Life version. Different idol sacrifices, we know that idol is nothing in the world, and that there is no one. Even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods, yet for us there is God, Father, from whom all things exist. One Lord, through whom all things, and through whom all things. And we but knowledge is not in everyone. See some so accustomed to idols up until now, who as an idol sacrifice, and their conscience being bleached is defiled. So, some comments on this. If you go part of this, people Paul wrote to consider themselves to be knowledgeable. They knew their country, but we go back, we start reading, we see that they're not really they're basically puffed up, and knowledge puffs up, he says, and contrast knowledge with love. And we continue, for suppose someone sees you that we have this knowledge, dining in an idol temple. If his conscience is weak, won't he be bold to eat idol sacrifices? One who is weak is destroyed by our knowledge, for whom Messiah died. So, just from this, we see that Paul is cautioning his readers to not do this, so to embolden people to eat idol sacrifice. He's basically saying to not eat idol sacrifice. He's trying to motivate them from the inside to do it, not because I say so, but you know that's the wrong thing to do. And continue reading. In this way, when you sin against your brothers and sisters and wound their conscience, which is weak, or when it's weak, you sin against Messiah. For this reason, if food causes any brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again, so that I do not cause my brother to stumble. And so the direct approach, no idolatry means not eating idol sacrifices.
Which, idol sacrifices is one of the reasons why I have a problem with halal meat, because it's badly butchered for one, so it's not good meat to begin with. And then the entire way it's made halal is it's prayed over for Allah.
Yeah, halal meat is not is really kind of a sacrifice to idols, in my opinion.
Yes,
but you see, in some places, you see not necessarily meat. I've seen cheese have both a kosher symbol and a halal symbol. I can't remember the brand now, but I've seen it.
Yeah, I've seen it on several things.
Unless they're equating that it's not from a unkosher animal or something and using it that way.
Well, I mean, they're saying that the practices are kosher in making cheese, they're not using things that are unkosher in the cheese.
Right.
And
And they might be
and-
using the halal the same way as opposed to,
Right, but halal cheese is not the same as halal meat. It's not.
Right.
It's not sacrificed. It's not prayed over
right.
in that same sense. So it's not. It wasn't killed, so to speak.
That is a hard one though, because like I've heard people say, used to like they'll say, oh, well, all that rabbi stuff just because they bless it, and you find out that's not true.
That's not. That's
At
not
all.
what it means.
Yeah.
But yet with the halal sense, you
It
find out
is.
that sometimes it is.
Yes.
The meat especially,
Right.
that's kind of the point to make it halal is it has to be prayed over.
Yeah.
The other products, not necessarily.
Drink it, don't breathe it.
Yeah, I know. Sort of laugh at the same time. Don't laugh and drink at the same time. It's bad. So the direct approach is, it seems like possibly from previous correspondence, they've rejected it. So we kind of take an indirect approach or a less direct approach now. Same conclusion though. Yes, there is no other Elohim but Elohim, and yes, there is no Lord or Master but Yeshua, but eating meat sacrificed to idols may cause your brothers and sisters to stumble, and that means you've sinned against both them and Messiah. So, therefore, don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. So, in chapter 9, I mean, if there's anything, if you wanted to, go back to chapter 8 and see if there's anything you want to cover, but that's what I have for slides for 8.
Can I
Yes.
just say that, would this be, what I'm trying to say, is this kind of command in a way, you know what I'm saying, from Paul?
Well, I think it's based on not associated with idols in the Torah. I mean, it's not something that Paul made up, I don't think.
Well, no, what I mean is it kind of like tying the gap between like Old Testament, New Testament, it's like commandment keeping. That's what I'm saying.
I think you would argue that. I think those that are in favor of eating meat sacrificed to idols would also be thinking that the whole Torah is done away with. So that
Yeah.
part doesn't really matter.
Still trying to find that in the Bible.
Second Hezekiah, chapter 3.
Oh,
She's just writing that down.
Sorry. Okay, so Paul continues his case against eating meat sacrificed to idols in chapter 9. He's building what was known as a kal v'chomer, a light and heavy argument. And it's you may have heard that term before as part of it's the first rule. It's the first rule of Hillel for biblical interpretation from it's probably, in truth, the rules of Hillel probably existed before Hillel, but it has his name attached to him at this point. We see Hillel's first rule of interpretation used by Yeshua in the Gospels. We know it was, but it predated Yeshua's time on earth, I'll say.
It was a very rabbinical thing to do, actually.
The argument is this: if that the light, then how much more this the heavy? That's basically the form of argument.
Yeah, Yeshua used it a lot, including if a sparrow can fall out of the sky and God knows about it, how much more so?
Yeah, exactly. I think you see when you see anything that says how much more. We call it an indicator in the Intel world, right?
Yeah.
How much more is an indicator of the kal v'chomer? So he continues is that if you have the right to eat meat sacrificed to idols, how much more do I or Barnabas have that right? However, they refrain from using that quote unquote right. So if you have the right to eat meat sacrificed to idols, how much more? It follows that if they have the more weighty right and refrain from using it, Corinthians, who have less weighty right, should likewise not eat that meat sacrificed to idols. So they also cause no hindrance to the gospel of Messiah. In other words, bring the good news people will cause people to stumble. That's the reasoning, the argument he's using. I think in this case, causing people to stumble because if you are a former pagan and you once ate the meat sacrifices of that particular deity, and you really truly believed in Artemis or Diana of the Ephesians, then you're stumbling because that's the case. So here's some text notes by John K. McKee. He translated he had the Messianic Renewed Covenant translation, which kind of morphed into the PME, the Practical Messianic Edition. It's still kind of a very niche, currently just a New Testament translation. But he has some text notes. And the phrase under Torah that you see is 10. This does not mean that when around Jews, Shaul keeps the Torah, and when he's around non-Jews, he does not keep the Torah. Being under Torah means that being subject to the Torah's penalties, something that believers are freed from. He does his best to place himself in their position or their predicament. So the predicament or position of Jewish brethren who do not know Messiah. So that's what he means by I might win those under Torah. He's not saying that he's, at some points in time he is keeping it, at some point in time he's not keeping it. He's just putting himself in the position of a fellow Jews that don't know Yeshua. Note 11, the Torah of Messiah. His note, Greek anomos Christo, which is from the Young's literal translation, Torah Messiah, is within law to Christ, according to the Young's literal translation. So it says that the best example of Shaul relating to those who do not know the Torah, while not compromising his Torah beliefs, is his encounter at Mars Hill in Athens at the temple to the unknown God. Acts 19, 16 to 34, read part of that this week. He was able to relate to the heathen just as able to relate to his Jewish brethren. So being able to relate to them doesn't necessarily mean that you are putting yourself in their position. In other words, doing what they do. I mean, to relate to people who are drunkards doesn't mean you have to be a drunkard yourself. Does that make sense?
Coming to them from the point of their understanding.
Yes, coming to relating to them, emphasizing with them, and empathy, I think, is the term that would be used for that.
I think that's what he was doing when he said he was a Pharisee, and when he said he was starting it, understanding what he said.
Yeah, all for a single. The goal, though, is to bring the gospel of Messiah to them.
Which includes the Torah.
Which includes, good news. So we get to 1 Corinthians 10. It's we've talked about this many times, right? Because 1 Corinthians 10, particularly 1 through 6 here, tells us a couple things. One, that the Torah was written for us, in the sense that for us, even today, now, that their example, people who went through the Exodus, their example was meant for us so that we would not fall into the same types of immorality that they fell into and stumble in the same way that they did. He also talks about the rock followed them. They drank from that spirit-sent rock, and he says the rock was Mashiach. And so the rock, Yeshua, provides water for life. And it's interesting that there is a concept of movable water sources in the Talmud. Miriam's well, a movable well, followed Israel in the wilderness, according to Shabbat 35a. And a text note in the Tanit of 9a of the Talmud says, a rock that accompanied the Israelites throughout their wanderings in the wilderness. So not just the well, but the idea of the rock following them is not something that's unique to Paul. It's also found in Jewish tradition as well.
So you don't think that's a metaphor?
Well, I think that a rock is a metaphor for, Yeshua isn't literally a rock.
Right.
So it is a
His
metaphor.
provision followed him.
Yeah, you could say that. I mean, the same thing for a Miriam's well, a movable well, is not really something that we actually see. We can look at it in the third perspective possibly it's not written in the Torah this way, but when Moshe hit the rock, if he's hitting the Messiah, that may be why he didn't get to go into the promised land.
Which actually, from what I understand, that was exactly what the reason behind it was, because it was
the reason
supposed
was
to
that
symbolize
was publicly disobeying.
Yeah.
And when the leadership publicly basically is defiled, so to speak, that's why he couldn't go in.
Right.
But metaphorically, Yeshua is the rock. He's hitting the source of life. Whack it.
Well, the first time he was told to
Yeah,
whack
the first
it,
time he was said
yeah.
to do that.
Right.
Second
Because
time.
which was a symbolize of the Messiah dying, but the second time he was supposed to speak to it, because that's what brings life.
Yeah, he was angry. He hit it with his cricket bat. Halo cricket bat.
Yeah, I at some point I'd like to go back to chapter 9, because there's some interesting stuff there that
Okay.
wasn't covered by what you had
Do
mentioned.
tell. Go ahead.
I kind of found it interesting about this one talks a lot about ministers getting paid.
Where is he from?
The whole, let me see.
Well, you're talking about the ox, not trans, yeah, the
Right.
worthiness, yeah.
Kind of starts in verse 4 and just keeps going. Because in verse 12 he says, but we don't make use of that right.
Right.
But
Yeah,
a
his
huge
example.
portion of that chapter is all about there is a right for, I mean, it isn't wrong for ministers to get paid.
Right.
We don't do it for, but it's
And
not
he
a
didn't
wrong
either.
thing.
He didn't either. But
Yeah.
it's but the idea of do not put a muzzle on an ox when it's treading out the grain.
Yeah.
Is the idea of making sure there is adequate provision for that.
Right.
It doesn't
And
necessarily
verse
mean-
14 specifically says, in the same way, the Lord directed that those who proclaim the good news should get their living from the good news.
Right. It doesn't necessarily mean 3 lotuses and a Range Rover.
Right. It does not mean that at all. It's enough to live on.
Private jet, yeah.
Multiple private jets.
And a jet ski.
A?
And private lake.
Oh, and a private lake for that jet ski. The gold jet ski.
So the examples from first, as Paul's referencing 1 Corinthians 10, are that idolatry and sexual immorality are the examples for us. And when you think about going back to your comment on ministers, what is the most common thing that unseats or basically destroys the ministry of
Sexual
ministers?
immorality.
Is sexual immorality. I mean,
And then money.
frequently. I mean, I'm sorry.
And then money.
And then money. It's not really.
Money isn't what gets them unseated. It's usually
Well,
when they.
I mean,
Well, Aaron Oklahoma it is.
It's greed.
well, I would look at money in this context could be something like being worshipped, right?
Yeah.
Because
True.
it becomes the
Materialistic.
money becomes an idol in that sense. The sole devotion to, quote, the almighty dollar. Well, the almighty is a term that's used to be from around
Yeah.
that. But sexual morality.
Oftentimes it's the minister becomes the idol, and it's I am owed this.
And they would quote that very thing to justify it. There's scripture.
So how much have I blessed you? But I would suspect that if you're not listening, but I mean, what are some of the other things from the lesson we can learn from wilderness? With the Messianic leadership at Oklahoma State Reformatory on the prisoner side, they believe that there is a spirit of Korach in that place, in terms of Messianic leadership, that there are essentially rebels that want to pull away, the small congregation that's there now to going to do whatever they want to do.
I was just thinking about that this week.
Well, become a leader, pull them away from other established leaders, I guess.
Okay, pull them away from the leaders.
And that, I haven't seen it personally, but John Rogers, who told me about a similar kind of situation that happened at one of the other prisons closer in Lexington. That basically it was Korach rebellion. Basically didn't like what John was teaching, I think, and so prisoners basically took over and didn't want him to come back. Basically, it was very strange.
That is weird.
I've seen that a lot.
That happens in churches too.
Oh, yeah.
And I always see it happen. Like if it's somebody that's really for God, that's when it happens. They want to like just about overthrow the one that the Most High sent and take over.
Yeah.
That's why modern deacon boards are not, well, or demon boards, are not run the biblical way.
Mhm.
I was just
There
excited.
are what's called deacons. Well, they're called shamashim in the Bible, but the job they did is what deacons are supposed to be doing now, because that's literally what that job is, and they're taking over the church.
I was thinking about something I that court this morning, because I was thinking what would happen if all the people in the country separated themselves from the people that are doing wickedly, you know what I'm saying, in our governments. You know, if they just say, basically, God, we're stepping away. We're separating ourselves, you know what I'm saying? You know, because, you know what I'm saying? Because everything's so mixed up and garbled. It's like we almost need a stepping away, like, you know, we're not with them, you know, like come out of her life kind of
That's
thing. You know?
interesting because I was like, it's some things I've been seeing. I feel like our God's doing that. Like he has his different ways where he's causing
The
that type
country,
of separation.
just watch what's going on in politics. Watch what's going on in the country. There is a very strong dividing line between
Yeah. I'm just
the
wondering if it's
left
going to
and the
literally
right.
be a physical one here pretty soon. Like literally, I mean, the whole thing with court is so unique in the Bible. You know what I'm saying? I mean, God, he said, I'm going to do a new thing. You know, it's never been done. So it's really interesting. You know.
I've seen the signs for it. If we turn against Israel, if we actually are involved in splitting Jerusalem, the country will physically be split. I'm very sure of it.
It's interesting.
There's a fault line runs straight through Oklahoma City. There's also a fault line that runs straight up the Mississippi. That, from what I understand, that section between Oklahoma City and the Mississippi is going to turn into basically well, not a lake, a sea, a new sea. It's literally going to separate the United States.
Well, there's I don't know if you've seen this, but the Biden administration wants to give $1 million grant to pay people to report human rights violations against Israelis.
Say that last part again.
The U.S. government is putting together a program to give $1 million grant money to as part to pay people to report human rights violations by Israelis.
Nazi brown shirts all over again.
But that is, you mean, so against, he wants to, against.
And of course, they're not going to report
So-
anything that the Muslims do.
But that would make it essential that people step back and say, I'm not with, you know what I'm saying, it's with the other people around, you know what I'm saying?
Well, it would be particularly for the Palestinians to report it. That's what the money is going to.
Right. Even if those same Palestinians are actually committing human rights violations.
Because I was just reminded that that's what this is all about. It's about Iran and Israel and all that, you know. It's-
The Palestinians have committed human rights violations
Oh, yes.
consistently against their own people.
So Paul, against the people that said they have the knowledge that idols are nothing, he says they're not nothing, that they're actually demons. Verse 20. But not only that, what the nation sacrifice to is demons and not to the Almighty, and not want to become sharers with the demons. Which, you know, it kind of nests actually with I think it's Leviticus 17 that talks about don't bring don't just sacrifice in the backyard, so to speak. Bring your sacrifice to the tabernacle. Otherwise, it's akin to being counted as sacrificing to goat demons.
Oh, the word satraps or satraps.
Something like that. It's the same word as it's the Greek word for fawn or something like that. Or it's related. It's a Hebrew word, but I'm saying the Greek word for fawn is related to the same root word. It's like that, but it's not satrap.
So the sacrificer would not even know who he's
Say again?
sacrificing.
Seder.
Get a little thing with this.
There's some, there's some,
T-Y-R.
yeah, they're similar to fawns in some respects.
Someone gave us this thing. It was silver.
So, in terms of how your Bible translates things, were there quotation marks in ancient Greek or Aramaic?
No,
No, right? So it's hard to if you just I'd say the majority of translations don't put things in quotation marks. This is from the Good News of Messiah translation. He adds even to highlight the quotation marks. He adds the words "they say" in italics to give the emphasis that it's not what Paul is saying or Shaul is saying, but it's what the they are saying. His note was this: the italics recognize that some others have done. Paul's statement is in fact an argument from the opposition that the faithful in Corinth were facing. Gnostic theology was just starting to form against the faithful at this time, so Paul's responses seem quick and tentative. A more severe condemnation of the makers of these arguments after they infiltrated the assemblies comes later from Yochanan. John. So they say all things are lawful, but I do not. But I say not all things are profitable. They say all things are lawful, but I say not all things edify. Let no one seek his own good, but that of his neighbor. So have you ever talked to people that would say that, well, Paul said now that all things are lawful, because their Bible didn't have those italicized they says or even the quotation marks. Because I think it's literal without the quotation marks and literal without the they say, but it's not in my view doesn't contain what was actually being said. So in this case, the literal, without adding some note to it or something else to it for understanding, actually degrades our understanding of the text. Eat all being sold in the meat market without asking questions for the sake of such unawareness. Now, a lot of people take issue with this, not take issue, but say, well, here's where Paul is saying that you can eat anything sold in the meat market. And by that he means probably pigs too.
I sat in a sermon in a church where he used exactly that, and that's what he said. All things are to be received. And he pulled up Acts chapter 10 too. You can eat everything. Stop. I remember the sermon. He said, "Stop saying I don't eat everybody's greens. Stop saying I'm not eating everything from their house because you don't know what they put in it. All things are to be received. You're supposed to eat everything." I'll never forget that song.
So we're having kegogi tonight. Want any?
I don't even know what that is.
Oh, Korean for dog.
Oh, okay.
So his text note. It's often presumed by interpreters that the meat markets were heavily contaminated with idol meat and that it was permissible to buy there even if a small amount of meat was uncontaminated and you did not know which was which. It is assumed that if one were shopping a Corinthian meat market, that the meat bought would almost surely be idol meat. On the contrary, only some small amount of such meat may be somewhere in the market. Meat generally came straight from the farms and farmers. Therefore, one buys from a place where idol meats are not expected, but may be there upon a possibility. As soon as we are informed where the idol meat is, and as soon as we can identify it by labeling or it being reported to us, then its attachment to the idol is not completely broken. The meat becomes forbidden by law for the sake of others, including pagans who need to repent. But too many Christians think that Paul has set aside the Jerusalem Council because their teachers have twisted his words around to teach it is permitted. In this modern age, we are concerned about our food supply being corrupted by man-caused toxins and perversions. We should be wary of false pagan religions attached to food products also. Why would one be concerned about the lesser contamination without concern for the greater? Which again,
Ooh,
makes sense.
I see what he did there. I see what he did there.
Yeah. From there.
Okay, so grading is the same unless it is something.
So, this is in chapter 11. Is Paul anti-Kippah? This is reading from the New American Standard here. Every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying disgraces his head. But every woman who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. She is one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. This is my comment. This is an example of translations that do not understand the Jewish context in which Paul lived and the Jewishness of the first century followers of Yeshua, even in Corinth. First consider about something on your head. First consider that the Second Temple was still operational at the time, right? What did the priests wear? Were they had their head shaved and nothing on it, or were their head covered like with turbans? I think is the translation, right? So, was he saying then that what the Torah says for them to do causes them to not or to be a disgrace? I can't see that to be the case. And this Tim Hicks comment: if the Torah prescribed headgear for the priest, it could hardly be reasoned that men wearing something on their heads was fundamentally wrong.
I think that verse was supposed to be put in
Italics or quotation marks?
maybe, but it was supposed to be taken as ironic or something similar to that.
Well, I don't know, because when we continue reading this is a commentary. It's not scripture, it's commentary, but what Tim Haig's view is that the head coverings is really not really talking about things on their head so much as the hair itself. His comment is Paul's not referring to head coverings in this passage. As such, he was not requiring the congregation at Corinth to abandon the Jewish tradition for men to cover their heads while praying. He was, however, reinforcing a Jewish perspective on the husband/wife relationship, in which the wife receives a position of authority in the community of God, in the community by virtue of her marriage relationship. He's also stressing the importance of marking the distinction between male and female and the God-given roles each is to perform within the believing community. In the Jewish society of the first century CE, these distinctions were marked in some measure by how one wore his or her hair. So
It was an authority thing.
yeah, I think that'd be the way. So yeah.
But the only covering a man has is God.
Yeah.
But a man is supposed to cover spiritually, cover his wife.
Remember the blanket being let down on the ground with all sorts of unclean animals and all the theology that's
Peter.
built around that.
Peter.
That was Peter.
I mean, Peter, I'm
Yeah.
sorry. And,
Yes.
yeah, so we always say, what do you mean? Why are you trying to build all this stuff around it? He says what it means.
Yeah.
Does here too.
Yeah.
It's not talking about head coverings. The head of the wife is the man,
And the head of the man is God.
is Yeshua.
Yeshua.
He's not talking about head coverings. He's talking about a woman should not prophesy or minister without the authority of her husband. That's her head being her head.
Well,
And man can't do it without doing it under the authority of Yeshua.
or her father, if she's not
Because
married.
Yeshua should not be covered. His head is not covered. So
He
the
is
head
the
of the
cover.
man is not covered.
No, actually, Yeshua is covered. He's covered by God the Father.
He is God the Father.
Here
I and my
Is
Father
it-
are one.
True, but he also said I was given the authority by God the Father. The authority he has, Actually,
was
we
physical.
read,
Is God physical?
no,
He's spiritual.
right,
Was Yeshua physical?
yes.
Yes. Yeshua was the physical manifestation of God.
And this head covering that
He's
is
not
talking about,
God, he is God.
it's a spiritual
Okay,
covering.
you're right.
It's a spiritual covering.
You're right.
But that is a big deal, though, for people that starts to follow Torah. Is the kippah can be a real and the
Yeah, but
talit
he
can be a
explains
real
these things. Sometimes, some places he says what he means.
Oh, yeah,
We
I'm
still
talking about,
want to argue what he means.
Christian
This is
Yeah.
it's kind of
believers.
like
They
one
get
of the
real
places
upset
where
about it. You know?
with the vision or the dream that Peter had, he went on to explain exactly what it meant. That it's commonly misinterpreted as now pigs are
Yeah.
kosher or something.
And on the other, the thing I picked out about that particular verse is that nowhere in there did God say that those things that he lowered were clean. Nowhere in here. He said kill and eat. He didn't say they were clean. And at the end, he said, whatever I say is clean is clean.
This is not the dream was not about food. It was about
It was not about food.
okay. So my closing comment on this thing. In other words, Paul doesn't think. Paul says that men are not women and women are not men. So people have been debating this.
Unless you're on a swim team.
Well, that is what people. That's what other people say. Paul says men are not women and women are not men.
Paul's gonna lose his Twitter account.
He's already been banned.
He's been banned for a long time.
So can get him on Getter. Okay, chapter 12. You know that when you were of the nations, you were led astray to dumb idols, whoever you were carried away. I think the implication is talking about something in the past when you were of the nations. So if they were no longer of the nations, they were no longer goyim, no longer Gentiles. So one may make an indirect connection, in my view, to northern kingdom Israel, in that Israel was also carried away into captivity because of their idolatry. Now, this is an interesting passage. Maybe hard to see. I've got a pointer, but I'm not sure it would work that well for this. But let's see. So the Aramaic in the English translation says that no one is able to say that Yeshua is Maria except by the Ruach Hadsha, or the set apart spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh in Hebrew. It's the last. It's in the slide. It's the last two words. Barucha Hadsha Kadisha.
Isn't this what you were brought up in the youth thing about Maranatha?
Yeah.
Isn't that the master?
No, this cognate is Ruach HaKodesh.
No, I meant the Maria.
Oh, okay, yeah. I'm sorry, yeah. Maria is related to Maran, but not Maran.
Okay.
It's the same root word, and so Maran is part of that same family of words. Maria, Maran. That means master. But yes, you're right in that.
Yeah, I knew the other one.
Yeah.
Even though I had never seen it before, I knew what that was.
Okay, so on the slide, it's maybe we'll put a corner on there. Blind someone, close your eyes. Don't
This one's so hard for me because it says Mary. And I just can't get it to my page where it always says Mary. And so I don't know what it is.
Okay, does it show up at all?
Isn't that what Denver's daughter's name is? Is
Not showing up.
Maria Lucia?
Nope, you'll have to use the bright one.
See if it's.
She has a really interesting.
There,
There you
that's
go.
that's
This
showing.
is
And it's reflecting.
it's reflecting lots. So I wanted to. That's the word "duh" is of, and then Maria, Bim Resh Yud Aleph. Marya. Mar is the root essentially, and Marya is the word that in the Peshitta Tanakh, 99.99% of the time is a euphemism or the Aramaic way to express Yud Hey Vav Hey in the Peshitta Tanakh. So it's equivalent to Yud Hey Vav Hey in the Hebrew Tanakh. So no one is able to say that Yeshua is Marya except by the Ruach Kadsha, or no one is able to say that Yeshua is Yud Hey Vav Hey except by the Ruach HaKodesh. That's what you see in the Aramaic text of 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 3. Sorry about the slide. This looks like it's odd, but okay. If I speak with the languages of men and of angelic messengers, do not have love, I have become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. So, what are the languages of men? Well, according to the Zohar, now we know the Zohar is not scripture, but Zohar is a mystical Jewish text. The language of angels is none other than Hebrew, and the language of men is the result of the Tower of Babel. We also see the language of men as being listed as being Aramaic too in some other places. So, if I speak in the language of men or of angelic messengers, now part of it is you see where two angels are talking to each other here in Isaiah chapter 6. And what language are they speaking? According to the text, they're speaking Hebrew. This is what they're saying there below. So the quote, you recognize this as, not from this particular translation, which is more holy than the holiest holiness. You recognize the three words there, though, right? Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. That's what it says there in the Hebrew text. Or holy, holy, holy. And they're speaking, as recorded by the Hebrew Tanakh, they're speaking in Hebrew, and they say Kadosh, Kadosh. So the idea that the language of angels is Hebrew, unless this is a translation from angelic language to Hebrew, this is what Isaiah saw, right?
That's so smart. I never thought. I'm just like, that's neat. You're right.
Could have been a translation, though. Could very easily have been a translation. Or, well, the thing is
you look at the Hebrew, it says they were crying out to each other, and then it says Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. So it doesn't give the indicator that I'm translating from what they were saying. This is what they said.
On the other hand,
well, I'm just saying the idea that Hebrew is the language of angels could be drawn.
Sounds
from,
a bit
from
conceited,
this,
actually.
Yeah, it could be drawn from this passage.
Yeah, but it also sounds a bit conceited.
But which would you say? Is it which
It
version
doesn't
of
say
Hebrew
it
is it?
isn't.
Right? Is
Right.
it modern Hebrew? Is it? Do they say Shabbos or do they say? Could.
Wonder,
I heard.
on the other hand, we don't know exactly how they pronounced it back in even David's time. They wrote it. We aren't exactly sure how they pronounced it because there aren't any vowel markings then.
Oh no, there were vowel markings still. After the temple was destroyed. And there were more than one, as you probably know.
Yeah, after the temple was destroyed. I said David's time.
Oh, yeah.
That was before the first temple.
Right. There's no. There are. There are more than one version of vowel points too. By the way, the modern one is the one that survived the Nicodemus, but there were other vowel markings used. Tongue of angels, verse 1. If I speak with the language of men of angels, but do not have love, become a noisy gong or changeable. They had supposed that use of either languages, literally tongues, which is an archaic term for other languages, more spiritual. Therefore, they did not regulate it or require interpretation. Paul says that the spiritual goal is prophecy and not the languages, which are only the means to the end. Perhaps they suppose this because of what happened at Shavuot in Acts 2, because the standard of pagan priestesses around them was to utter unintelligible ravings, and then others interpreted them. what's the anybody remember what the most famous of those pagan priestesses that uttered unintelligible ravings? The oracle
Delphi.
at Delphi, right? So I don't. That's all I have for 13. If somebody else has anything else, chapter 14.
Yeah, if we went over 13, I mean, you could get all kinds of preaching done out of that chapter.
So let me do a quick check. It's now 2000, so sun is set. But
Isn't that what the next thing I want to see about Revelation?
is it?
When you check when moonrise is.
Oh, moonrise moon's up.
Oh, okay.
Moonrise is 0813. Moon set is what we're looking for, which is 2133.
It was really,
So we still probably have a little bit of time.
I mean, it was, it was a documentary.
So Paul writes, in the Torah it is written. So the Greek text here says nomos, and the Aramaic says namusa, which is usually translated as Torah or law.
Human side, human side.
Is that what it was?
No.
Here, in my view, here Torah refers to the whole of Scripture, not just the books of Moshe. And when he's this quote here, it's actually from Isaiah 28. So he's making Midrash on Isaiah 28 and what follows here in Isaiah. The prophecy refers to the history of Israel in exile. Israel would learn Aramaic, Greek, and other languages as they forgot Hebrew, and that they would have to hear the scriptures in those other languages. Historically speaking, upon return from the exile in Babylon, they had to have the Aramaic Targumim, or Aramaic translations of the Torah, read alongside the Hebrew text. Even so, Israel continues not listening to the Almighty, even when confronted with the fruits of their disobedience in foreign languages, like English. This section here, I think, is the key point of chapter 14. If therefore the whole assembly should assemble together and all speak in other languages, and unlearned men or unfaithful ones enter, they will not say that you are. Will they not say that you are mad? But if all prophesy and an unfaithful one or unlearned man enters, he is convicted by all. He is called to account by all. The secrets of the heart are disclosed, and so he will fall on his face and worship the Almighty, declaring that the Almighty is certainly among you. So this is talking about how much more value, I think, he's talking about in terms of prophecy versus language. But when you look at this idea of I'm sorry, I thought I have a slide at a different place. I thought I had a slide right here. Okay, we'll continue on with this. The idea of this passage, 1433. God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all churches of the saints from King James. Or God not the God of unruliness, but of shalom. Passages cause a lot of confusion, since Strong's Concordance indicates that one of the meanings of the Hebrew word tohu in Genesis 1 verse 2 is confusion. So according to the Dake's Bible, if the Almighty is not the author of confusion, he did not create the world as tohu, but it became that way by Satan. Thus, the author of Pre-Adamic Man, this theory of Pre-Adamic Man, the earth becoming tohu by Satan, then comes Adam after that period. The big problem with this idea behind the oxymoronic statement of Pre-Adamic Man is the same thing as man and Adam is the same word, just different language. So you can't say pre-Adam Adam because that, what does that even mean, right? Is that when we see the word choice used in the Septuagint, it doesn't match the Greek New Testament. So it's a word with a specific meaning. Akatas keustos means unformed, but here in 1 Corinthians 33, it's not that word. It's akatastatos. Thank you. And the word is what? Tumult, right? Which is, in contrast, it's the opposite of something, the opposite of shalom. It's not unformed versus formed, it's shalom versus tumult. And that's what's going on here. So it's not even the right word to be.
Unruly is pretty close.
Yeah, but I'm saying unruly is a good translation, but confusion and using that word confusion to go back to Genesis 1:2 doesn't work, because even though it's confusion in English, it's not. It's really confusing because it's not even the same Greek word used. That makes sense. I mean, just remember, Genesis verse 1 verse 2 wasn't written first in Greek, right? The Septuagint wasn't the original.
So
But-
the proper translation should be
Well,
non-shalom versus shalom.
yeah, like you say, anti-shalom versus shalom, but not really confusion in that same sense.
So more stressed out than peace.
Yeah. So here's a question, and it's an interpretational question. Since it's I don't really have an answer for this. I'll be straight here. Here's the two verses that seem to be in contrast. Someone speaking in a tongue is not speaking to people but to God, because no one can understand, since he is uttering mysteries in the power of the Spirit. Verse 27 says, if the gift of tongues is exercised, let it be by two or at most three, and each in turn, and let someone interpret. So the question is, if tongues is tongues being used in two different ways here? If tongues are speaking to Elohim in a language and no one can understand, how can it be interpreted?
That's the thing. It is interpreted when it's in it should be interpreted if it's in a congregational setting. But this is also talking about, because you're talking to God when you're speaking when you're praying in tongues and speaking in tongues, you're talking to God. If you're by yourself, you don't need anybody to interpret, because it's between you. I mean, it's between your heart and God. But in a congregational setting, it really needs to be interpreted. And this, a lot of what this chapter is about is things in right order, so that there isn't any confusion, so there isn't any tumult.
What I'm saying here is that tongues can't only mean other human languages.
Right. Absolutely.
But the most common, what we see when tongues are used in Acts 2, they definitely are only in other human languages.
Yeah, in that case, they were.
So there are two,
Because there was a purpose for
So I'm
those.
saying that there are
two types of tongues.
two types of tongues.
One is your soul talking to God. The other is human language.
Even
seems
if
like
it's a
the one
language
that
you
could be-
don't know.
Is that say, could that be saying in the congregation, if someone comes in and doesn't understand the human language you're talking in, there needs to be an interpreter,
Oh.
otherwise he's not edified, he don't know what you're talking about.
Considering some of the other things he said, that absolutely sounds like that could be part of what he was referring to.
It seems, I mean, these are happening probably in congregations that are multilingual, or at least have the ability, because within the Roman Empire, Greek is a trade language, but there were also Jewish people in the congregation, and maybe their primary language was Aramaic or Hebrew. There may have been Romans in the congregation, the primary language was Latin. So
It'd be
anyway,
like many nations coming in here, people from other nations. That don't happen here,
Might be in trouble.
but I would imagine in that setting, you had different nations.
Mhm.
Look how many different nations were there.
all the exiles that didn't have Hebrew as their first language anymore, or even Aramaic, perhaps, or the language that they were in, was the, what version of Greek they're speaking in this. Okay, fitting. This talks about resurrection, and comment: the resurrection of Messiah Yeshua is the key defining characteristic of our faith. If it didn't happen, our faith is useless. The following slides are based on Dr. Gary Habermas's minimal facts approach to the case for the resurrection. This was done for a different. I grafted this in from a different presentation. If don't know if you've ever heard of this. This is a pretty important book. I recommend it. It's called The Case of the Resurrection of Jesus by Gary Habermas and Mike Licona. If you didn't have our faith, is useless, and these slides are based on that Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. Gary Habermas and Mike Licona. So, what the minimal facts approach that he uses is the data is strongly evidenced. The data are granted by virtually all scholars, even skeptical ones, like Bart Ehrman, for example. And support historical claims, multiple independent sources, attestation by an enemy or someone who would not be favorable to it, embarrassing admissions, eyewitness testimony, and early testimony. And so their comment is, in their book, The Case of Resurrection, the New Testament is not assumed to be inspired or necessarily reliable, but ancient literature containing 27 books or letters, and then using only the data accepted by nearly every scholar, including the skeptical ones. So, in terms of the minimal facts approach, fact number one, Yeshua was crucified. And that is, even attested to by anti-Yeshua scholars in that sense. Quote, that the crucifixion, or that he was crucified, is as sure as anything historical can ever be. And that's from sort of the Jesus seminar, who basically tries to rule out things. But you also see, ancient Roman writers, Greek writers, an Aramaic writer. You see a reference to a crucifixion actually in the Talmud in 743, which is like this. This implies only immediately before the execution, but not provided previous thereto. In contradiction to this, it was taught on the eve of the Passover, Yeshua the Nazarene was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, he hurled forth and cried. So I think some of the data or the scripture is wrong. The testimony here, the narrative is wrong, but the idea of that it was Yeshua of Nazareth, and this says, but since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of the Passover and the eve of the Sabbath. So the eve of the Sabbath appears in one manuscript, the eve of the Passover appears in other Talmudic manuscripts. So there is Talmudic testimony that Yeshua was executed. That's fact one. Fact two, they believed that he rose from the dead and appeared to them. Skeptical scholars agree that Paul wrote 7 New Testament books, including 1 Corinthians. And what we read today included the earliest, according to them, the earliest record, the earliest creed in the New Testament, dated, I'm not saying 1 Corinthians dated to 5 years after the resurrection. We're saying the phrase within this text was an ancient creed or perhaps a song that dates to within 5 years of Yeshua's resurrection. And that's from anti-Yeshua scholars. They don't necessarily believe the resurrection is true, but they say it occurred 5 years, within 5 years after, it dated to within, not all of them say that, some say within 20, but 5 years of a skeptical scholar says that this phrase was written. We'll see that in just a second. And they believe that 7 sources testify to the willingness to suffer and die. So after this little facts approach is done, I have the part that is quoted. So these are the 7 ancient sources that testify that Paul existed, was changed to persecute your believer, but also back here that testify that they believe that Yeshua rose from the dead. Fact 4 is that Yaakov or James changed. He has basically a conversion story similar to Paul, in the sense that the leadership is now James. Before that, he questioned Yeshua. Remember from Gospels, he basically said, he thought it was crazy. And that James was martyred. We see that in Josephus, Hegesippus, and Clement of Alexandria. I think Hegesippus is quoted by, I don't think his writings survive themselves, but he's quoted in others where his quotations were there. Fact 5 is not accepted by every scholar, but attested by the Jerusalem factor, the empty tomb produced the body, and enemy attestation. They stole the body, they blamed them for it, and embarrassing witnesses for it. Women. No offense, women, but your testimony was not considered to be as, if you're relying on women's testimony, that means that we're relying on embarrassing testimony. So our witnesses are women. Doesn't sound right, but.
Thank you.
That was how it was thought of at the time.
Yeah.
We'll go with that.
Okay. So the early creed, this is from 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7. And the part that starts is, I'll try to put it a different color. It's a bit different color on this screen at least. That's where it says, the creed would be, the Messiah died for our sins in accordance with what the Tanakh says, and he was buried, he was raised on the third day in accordance with what the Tanakh says, and he was
seen by Kepha, then by the 12, and afterwards he was seen by more than 500 brothers at one time, the majority of whom are still alive, though some have died. Later on, he was seen by Yaakov, then by all the emissaries.
Thank you. So that is the, according to even skeptical scholars, this quotation, this belief, this creed dates to within 5 years of the resurrection. Now, I'm not saying that 1 Corinthians is that old, but he's quoting something that already existed at the time. So it's well known to his hearers was a quotation of this creed that they've already probably have as part of their Shabbat service. Okay. So this is talking about the last shofar, final shofar. So you see also a different shofar, Shofar HaGadol, associated with Yom Kippur. John McKeith's comment is, this is the seventh trumpet judgment of Revelation 11:15, when the kingdom of the world becomes that of Messiah. The seventh trumpet is blown in a post-tribulation context to call for resurrection and the gathering of the saints. Continuing comment on this, and really the phrase Motzei Shabbat, you probably recognize, it's saying that at the end of Sabbath, we would look at it and how we do it, the Havel, right after the end of Shabbat, Motzei Shabbat, or Havel. The first of the week biblically occurs on, quote, Saturday evening, the time right after Shabbat. So he's saying, in regard to the collection being made for God's people, you are to do the same as directed in the congregations in Galatia do every week on the first day of the week, is what he says. Motzei Shabbat is what is translated here, and Havdalah, or first day of the week, is in, not on Shabbat, I would say. Why would you want to do collections on Shabbat, right? You don't do collections on Shabbat. People might say, well, see, that's an indicator that they're all worshiping on Sunday now, because doing collections on Sunday.
That's kind of why they did it on Sunday, because they didn't want to do it on Shabbat.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So this is his translation. He takes it a little bit differently. Instead of saying the first of the way he's understanding it is in verse 2. Instead of on the first day of the week, he's saying on the first of the Sabbaths. His translation is. It's literally down through the first of the Sabbaths, and he puts in parentheses after Passover. So 7 Sabbaths are counted after Passover to Shavuot in the traditional Pharisaic understanding of counting over. Paul references Shavuot in verse 8, so this seems to fit the context. That's the interpretation of that. And this is the Maranatha. So if you had this slide, you could have got the point. Okay. Maranatha is 2 words, Maranatha. For example, the example from Nehemiah 10 is that the Hebrew text reads Yud-Heh-Vah-Heh Adonenu. Pashida Aramaic Tanakh reads Marya Maran. Same thing. The Marya is the equivalent of Yud-Heh-Vah-Heh, and Maran is our master, same as Adonai. All right. So that's all I have, I think. Oh, one more. We have Acts 19. So, okay. So, yeah, it's a Midrash on Ekklesia. In Acts 19:32, so then they were shouting one thing and another, for the assembly was in confusion, and the majority did not know what reason they had come together. Yes, that is the word assembly there. That is the word ekklesia. So ekklesia doesn't always mean called out assembly of the righteous or a reference to Israel. It's about these guys are about to have a riot.
They had assembled them in one place, but yeah,
And it's the same. It's the same actually in the idea is the same thing in Aramaic is kanusha, the crowds, and they had assembled kansho. The same word as kanushta. You recognize that from the Aramaic equivalent of ekklesia and of kahal is kanushta. You recognize that from the Knesset. Same.
I caught that right away.
All right. Well, now that's all I have. So we need to walk outside and take a look for Rosh Kodesh. Shall we?
How does that work?
what?
Kahal?